The little girl's tears streamed down her face as she uttered those heartbreaking words. "I want to study too, stepmother." Her plea echoed through the cold, unforgiving room, a testament to dreams denied and hopes crushed by circumstance. Nobody could have predicted what happened next, when a millionaire suddenly appeared behind them, about to change everything with just a few words. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Rain streaked the windows of the Johnson estate, painting watery trails down the glass as 8-year-old Mary Johnson pressed her forehead against the cold surface. Her small fingers clutched a worn doll tightly against her chest, the frayed fabric companion her only solace in moments like these. The doll, once bright and new, now showed the marks of constant handling, a testament to the comfort it provided when nothing else would. Beyond the heavy oak door of the study, a different world existed. Sunlight spilled across velvet drapes and gilded bookshelves, creating a warm glow that seemed to mock the gray chill where Mary stood. Inside, her older stepsister Sarah Johnson sat at the polished mahogany desk, her posture perfect as she absorbed herself in French verbs. The fountain pen in Sarah's hand moved with practiced precision across fine paper, each stroke deliberate and confident. Mary watched through the crack in the door, mesmerized by the scene. The study was a sanctuary of knowledge. Leather-bound volumes lined the walls, maps of distant lands hung in ornate frames, and the scent of ink and parchment filled the air. It was everything the small girl longed for, a world of words and ideas that remained tantalizingly out of reach. Gathering her courage, Mary pushed the door open slightly wider. "I want to study too, stepmother," she whispered, her voice trembling with hope and fear intermingled. The words hung in the air, fragile as butterfly wings. Mrs. Jennifer Johnson didn't even bother to turn around. The matriarch's back stiffened at the interruption, her hand pausing momentarily as it guided Sarah through a particularly difficult conjugation. When she finally spoke, her voice cut through the room, sharp and cold as the winter wind outside. "That room is not for you," the woman stated flatly. "You wouldn't understand these things anyway." The dismissal was absolute, brooking no argument or appeal. Mary stood frozen, clutching her doll tighter as if it might shield her from the casual cruelty of the words. She watched as her stepmother returned her attention to Sarah, the moment of interruption already forgotten. The door shut with a soft but final click as Mrs. Johnson rose and deliberately closed it, sealing Mary out of that world of knowledge once more. The little girl remained in the hallway, her reflection ghostly in the rain-streaked window. The barrier between her and education, as impenetrable as the glass separating her from the storm outside. Mary bit her lip, blinking back tears she refused to let fall. The sting of rejection was familiar, a daily reminder that she didn't truly belong in this grand house. She traced her finger along the polished wood of the door that separated her from knowledge, from acceptance. The Johnson estate had never felt like home. Rather, it was a beautiful cage where she existed as a mere shadow, always watching others live the life denied to her. Through the keyhole, she could see Sarah's perfect posture as she practiced her French. Mary had memorized the sounds, whispering them to herself when no one could hear. Her worn doll, her only true confidant, had heard countless recitations in the privacy of her small bedroom tucked away in the east wing. The hallway stretched before her, its walls adorned with portraits of Johnson ancestors who seemed to judge her with painted eyes. Mary felt invisible, a ghost haunting corridors built on legacy and expectation, always relegated to the wrong side of every door that mattered. She clutched her doll tighter, the fabric worn smooth from years of similar moments. The ache in her chest threatened to swallow her whole, that familiar hollow feeling that expanded until breathing became difficult. She turned to retreat to her room, to hide her disappointment as she had learned to do so well. But then a deep voice echoed down the hallway, calm yet commanding, cutting through her despair like a knife. And who decided that? Startled, Mary spun around, nearly dropping her treasured doll. Standing at the end of the corridor was Robert Smith, tall and imposing in his long wool coat. His cane tapped gently against the marble floor as he approached. The businessman's unexpected presence sent a wave of confusion through her small frame. The millionaire moved with deliberate steps, his gaze fixed directly on Mary's face, not with the pity she'd had grown accustomed to, but with something else entirely. Recognition, as if he saw something in her that others had missed. "Mr. Smith," she whispered, quickly dipping into a curtsy as she had been taught. "I didn't know you had arrived." "Clearly," he replied, his voice softer now. He glanced at the closed study door, then back to Mary. "I asked you a question, child. Who decided that room is not for you?" Mary hesitated, unaccustomed to an adult actually waiting for her answer. Her late father's friend stood patiently, his presence filling the hallway with an authority that made her feel, for the first time in years, that someone was truly seeing her. Robert Smith, the elusive millionaire and her late father's oldest friend, had returned to the estate after years of silence. His sudden appearance caused ripples through the household staff, who whispered behind closed doors about his unexpected visit. The tall, imposing figure had once been a regular guest at the Johnson estate, but following Mary's father's death, he had vanished into the wider world. Rumors circulated about his business ventures in distant cities across England. Fortunes dramatically lost, then mysteriously regained. Partnerships formed and dissolved, and properties acquired throughout the countryside. Some servants speculated he'd been abroad, while others claimed he'd suffered illness or financial ruin. The truth remained as enigmatic as the man himself. None of these adult concerns mattered to Mary Johnson now. All she understood was the sudden presence of someone who looked at her differently. Someone who saw past her patched dress and unruly hair to something deeper. Robert's cane tapped softly against the polished floor as he approached. Unlike Mrs. Jennifer Johnson, who barely spared Mary a glance most days, the businessman studied her with careful attention. His gaze lingered not on her worn clothing or small stature, but on her eyes. Eyes that mirrored her late mother's in both color and intensity. "You have your mother's look about you," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of memories. She had that same hunger for knowledge. Mary's breath caught. No one spoke of her mother in this house. The scholar's name had been all but erased from the estate's history, her books packed away, her portrait removed from the main hall. Robert knelt down, despite his formal attire, bringing himself to Mary's level, a gesture no adult had offered her in years. "You want to learn, Mary?" he asked softly, his tone devoid of the condescension that usually colored grown-up questions directed at her. Something inside the child stirred, a fragile hope she'd nearly forgotten existed. Her small fingers tightened around her worn doll, her only remaining connection to her mother. "More than anything, sir," she whispered, afraid that speaking the words too loudly might cause them to shatter like glass. His weathered hand reached out, not to pat her head dismissively as others did, but to rest briefly on her shoulder, a gesture of alliance. "Then perhaps," he said with the hint of a smile forming beneath his neatly trimmed mustache, "we should see what can be done about that." That night, Mary Johnson crouched in the shadowed alcove outside the study, her small frame pressed against the wall as she strained to hear every word. Inside, Sarah traced neat lines in her leather-bound exercise book, her fountain pen gliding across the expensive paper with practiced ease. "Répétez après moi, Mrs. Earn," Jennifer Johnson instructed, her voice crisp with authority. "Je suis, tu es, il est, nous sommes." Sarah dutifully repeated each conjugation, her pronunciation precise under her mother's watchful eye. The matriarch stood behind her daughter, one hand resting possessively on the back of the chair. Occasionally, Mary's lips silently formed each word, committing them to memory. "Je suis, tu es, il est." The foreign syllables felt strange, yet beautiful on her tongue. She observed how Sarah's wrist moved as she wrote, the angle of the pen, the careful formation of each letter. Every detail was precious knowledge to be hoarded like treasure. When Mrs. Johnson stepped away to pour herself tea, Mary caught Sarah's eye through the crack in the door. For a fleeting moment, something passed between the stepsisters, recognition, perhaps even understanding, before Sarah quickly returned to her studies. "Focus, Sarah," the older woman snapped, noticing her daughter's momentary distraction. "Your future depends on these accomplishments." Hours later, when moonlight spilled through the tall windows of the Johnson estate and the household had fallen into slumber, Mary crept from her small bedroom. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath her careful steps as she made her way down the hallway, clutching a broken slate and a stub of chalk she'd salvaged from the gardener's shed. In a forgotten corner near the servants' quarters, Mary knelt and pried up a loose floorboard with practiced fingers. The hiding place contained her meager collection of learning materials, scraps of paper with copied sentences, a torn page from an old primer, and now her slate. With trembling hands, she began to write. "Je suis Mary, tu es Sarah, il est Monsieur Smith." Each stroke of chalk was deliberate, each mistake carefully erased and corrected. The girl worked by the dim light filtering through a nearby window, her determination unwavering despite her exhaustion. These stolen moments of learning were Mary's quiet rebellion against the limitations imposed upon her. Every word memorized, every sentence formed was a small victory, a step toward the education that was her birthright, yet denied by her stepmother. As the first hints of dawn threatened the eastern sky, Mary carefully returned her slate to its hiding place, brushing chalk dust from her nightgown. Tomorrow night, she would return and learn more. This secret knowledge, this forbidden learning, was fueled by something powerful within her small frame, a combination of longing and courage that would not be extinguished. The attic had become Mary Johnson's sanctuary, a place where Mrs. Jennifer Johnson rarely ventured due to the dust that might soil her fine dresses. On this particular evening, rain drummed against the roof with increasing intensity, creating a melody that masked Mary's footsteps as she explored the forgotten corners of the space. A loose brick near the chimney caught her attention. Unlike the others, it protruded slightly, as if inviting curious fingers to investigate. Mary tugged gently, and to her surprise, the brick slid out with ease, revealing a small cavity behind. Her heart quickened as she reached inside and extracted a leather-bound notebook, its edges worn with age. Settling beneath the small window where raindrops created shifting patterns of light, Mary opened the notebook with trembling hands. The pages were filled with elegant script, equations, poetry, and scientific observations intermingled with personal reflections. The handwriting was delicate, yet confident, somehow familiar, though she couldn't recall ever seeing it before. The molecular structure suggests properties previously unobserved, read one passage, followed by detailed sketches. Another page contained verses about the changing seasons, capturing the essence of autumn leaves with words that made Mary feel as if she could touch them. As she turned to the inside cover, her breath caught. Property of Elizabeth Johnson, Cambridge, 1876. Her mother's name. The woman she had only known through faded photographs and servants' whispered stories had been a scholar. Not just educated, but passionate and brilliant. Mary traced the ink with her fingertips, feeling a connection transcending time and death. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sadness, but recognition. Her hunger for knowledge wasn't merely childish defiance or envy of Sarah's opportunities. It was inheritance, blood-deep and undeniable. The young girl hugged the notebook to her chest, understanding now why Mrs. Johnson had been so determined to keep her from education. It wasn't just cruelty, it was fear. Fear that Mary might follow in her mother's intellectual footsteps and perhaps surpass both Sarah and her stepmother. "I am my mother's daughter," she whispered to the rain-washed attic, the words forming a shield against every dismissal and locked door she had encountered. Mary carefully wrapped the precious notebook in a scrap of cloth and returned to her hiding place beneath the floorboards of her small room. This treasure was more valuable than any doll or trinket. It was proof that her desires were not only valid, but her birthright. The knowledge burned within her, a flame that no amount of cold treatment from her stepmother could extinguish. Robert Smith's arrival at the Johnson estate cast a long shadow over the household's carefully maintained order. The tall businessman moved through the corridors with quiet authority, his cane tapping against the polished floors like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. Mrs. Jennifer Johnson observed his every movement with the wariness of a fox sensing a hunter, her smiles never quite reaching her eyes during their afternoon teas. "Your business in London must be quite prosperous these days," she remarked one evening, arranging her skirts carefully as they sat in the drawing room. "Yet you find time to concern yourself with household matters that hardly require your attention." Robert merely smiled, his gaze drifting toward the locked library door. "I find certain promises more binding than business contracts, Jennifer." In the kitchen below, servants exchanged theories in hushed whispers. The cook insisted he had returned to claim the estate, while the housemaid believed he carried secrets about the late Mr. Johnson. The butler, who had served the family longest, simply shook his head. "He watches the little one, Mary, like she's made of gold," he observed, silencing the others with his certainty. Sarah Johnson felt the shifting currents most acutely. At 13, she was perceptive enough to recognize the tension crackling between her mother and their distinguished guest, but too young to fully comprehend its source. During her French lessons, she would catch glimpses of her mother pacing near the windows, watching Robert Smith as he walked the grounds with Mary, pointing out plants and birds with the patience of a natural teacher. "Focus, Sarah," her mother would snap, noticing her daughter's wandering attention. "Your future depends on these accomplishments, not on daydreaming." At night, lying in her bed beneath embroidered coverlets, Sarah found herself thinking of Mary's face, how it transformed when Robert spoke to her, as though someone had lit a lamp behind her eyes. She recalled how her stepsister would press her small fingers against the library door when she thought no one was watching, and how her mother double-checked the lock each evening with grim determination. Sarah had never questioned why Mary wasn't permitted the same education she received. It was simply the way things had always been, like the separation of their bedrooms or the difference in their clothing. But now, watching her stepsister devour Robert's every word, Sarah recognized the hunger in Mary's expression. It wasn't envy of Sarah's pretty dresses or her mother's attention. It was something purer, a desperate thirst for knowledge that no amount of household rules could extinguish. For the first time, Sarah wondered if her mother's protectiveness might actually be fear. Mary Johnson discovered her opportunity one evening when Mrs. Jennifer Johnson casually mentioned needing fresh bread from the village bakery. The small girl seized this chance immediately, volunteering with such enthusiasm that even her suspicious stepmother couldn't find reason to refuse. As dusk settled over the English countryside, Mary clutched her worn basket and hurried down the winding path toward the village. Her heart raced not from fear of the gathering shadows, but from anticipation. The cottage stood at the edge of the village, small, with ivy climbing its stone walls and smoke curling from the chimney. A single lamp burned in the window, like a beacon calling her forward. "Mrs." Linda Brown opened the door before Mary could knock. The elderly woman's face was lined with wisdom, her gray hair pulled back in a simple bun. "I wondered when you might find your way here," she said, her voice gentle but knowing. "Please," Mary whispered, clutching her basket tighter. "I want to learn." The former tutor studied the child's determined expression. "Years ago," She had been dismissed from the Johnson estate for insisting that both girls receive equal education, a stance that Mrs. Johnson found intolerable. Now, seeing the hunger for knowledge in Mary's eyes, something resolved within the older woman. "Come in, child," she said finally. "We haven't much time." That first night, Mrs. Brown assessed what Mary already knew, which was surprisingly much, gleaned from eavesdropping on Sarah's lessons and studying discarded papers. The tutor was impressed by the girl's retention and eagerness. "You'll need to be careful," the elderly woman warned as she packed a slim book beneath the loaf of bread in Mary's basket. "Your stepmother would not approve." Night after night, Mary manufactured reasons to visit the village, sometimes for bread, other times for thread or to deliver messages. Each excuse brought her to the cottage where Mrs. Brown waited with lessons in reading, mathematics, and the rich history of their county. The girl absorbed everything like parched soil in rain. She practiced her letters by candlelight, hidden beneath her blankets long after the household slept. She calculated sums while scrubbing floors, recited historical dates while polishing silver. "You have your mother's mind," Mrs. Brown told her one evening, watching Mary solve a complex equation, quick and thorough. Mary looked up startled. "You knew my mother?" The tutor nodded, a shadow passing over her face. "I taught her too, many years ago. She would be proud of your persistence." As Mary hurried home that night, clutching her basket with its secret treasures of knowledge beneath the bread, she felt something new growing inside her. Not just learning, but a connection to her past, to the mother she barely remembered. Each lesson was bringing her closer to who she was meant to be. Mrs. Jennifer Johnson paced the drawing room, her suspicions growing with each of Mary's evening disappearances. The girl had been slipping away too regularly, always returning with a strange light in her eyes that unsettled the matriarch. One evening, as rain lashed against the windows of the Johnson estate, Jennifer decided to follow her stepdaughter. The house creaked with age as she traced Mary's footsteps, finally discovering the child huddled beneath the grand staircase. A single candle illuminated a tattered book, one Jennifer recognized from the library's collection. Mary was so absorbed in her reading that she didn't notice her stepmother's shadow falling across the pages. "What do you think you're doing?" Jennifer's voice cut through the silence like ice. Mary jumped, the book tumbling from her small hands. "I was just stealing books, disobeying direct orders?" Jennifer snatched the volume, examining its spine with disgust. "Philosophy? This is beyond inappropriate for a girl of your station." The following morning, Jennifer summoned Mary to the study. "Your behavior has become intolerable," she announced, her fingers drumming against the polished desk. "You are forbidden from entering the library wing. Every door will be locked, and the servants instructed to report any attempts at entry." Mary stood with her head bowed, but Jennifer could see the defiance in her posture. "Furthermore," the stepmother continued, "your chores will be doubled. The scullery needs scrubbing, the linens require mending, and the kitchen garden wants weeding. Perhaps physical labor will curb these ridiculous intellectual aspirations." That afternoon, Jennifer personally confiscated Mary's hidden treasures, the broken slate, chalk stubs, and scraps of paper the child had collected. She even took the worn doll Mary clutched at night, claiming it harbored contraband in its stuffing. "You'll thank me someday," Jennifer told her coldly. "These fantasies of education will only bring disappointment." Know your place, Mary. Yet something unexpected happened in the days that followed. Despite the harsh punishment, despite the exhaustion that left her fingers raw and her back aching, Mary Johnson's eyes grew brighter. Each scrubbed pot became a lesson in chemistry, each garden weed a study in botany. When Jennifer passed her in the hallway, she noticed the girl's lips moving silently, reciting something from memory. The injustice hadn't broken Mary's spirit, it had tempered it. In the kitchen, the cook whispered that she'd caught the child tracing letters in spilled flour. In the garden, the groundskeeper reported finding equations scratched in the dirt. Jennifer's fury only intensified. She couldn't understand how, despite everything, the spark in her stepdaughter burned stronger than ever. Sarah Johnson was returning from her evening piano lesson when she noticed a sliver of light beneath the door of the servants' pantry. Curious, she peered through the keyhole and discovered Mary hunched over a tattered scrap of paper, her small fingers tracing each word as her lips moved in silent determination. The younger girl's brow was furrowed in concentration, her worn doll propped against a jar as a silent study companion. Something shifted in Sarah's perception. For the first time, she saw not the quiet stepdaughter her mother dismissed, but a sister desperately reaching for knowledge that Sarah had always taken for granted. The intensity in Mary's eyes mirrored her own when mastering a difficult passage of music or French conjugation. That night, Sarah lay awake in her feather bed, troubled by the inequity she had long accepted without question. The memory of Mary's secret studies haunted her. Why should one sister have beautiful exercise books while the other scratched letters onto scraps? The question gnawed at her conscience until dawn broke over the estate's manicured gardens. The next afternoon, while her mother was occupied with the housekeeper, Sarah slipped into the study and selected a slim grammar book from the lowest shelf, one she had already completed. With heart pounding, she wrapped it in her handkerchief and tucked it beneath a loaf of bread she knew Mary would deliver to the kitchen. Mary's eyes widened when she discovered the treasure, looking up at Sarah with a mixture of suspicion and hope. Neither girl spoke of it directly, but a silent understanding passed between them. Soon, their conspiracy expanded. Sarah began leaving maps inside Mary's coat pocket, arithmetic problems tucked between linens, and poetry copied onto the backs of discarded invitations. Each gift was a small rebellion against the rigid hierarchy their mother enforced. "You're quite clever with numbers," Sarah whispered one evening, catching Mary practicing sums in the corridor. It was the first direct acknowledgement of their secret arrangement. Mary's smile was hesitant but genuine. "Thank you for the books," she replied, her voice barely audible. The complicity transformed them both. Sarah found herself noticing her stepsister's quick mind and determination, while Mary began to see that Sarah was not merely her mother's echo, but a person with her own thoughts and conflicts. Each clandestine exchange brought them closer, weaving a fragile alliance that neither had imagined possible. In their shared defiance of Mrs. Johnson's rules, the stepsisters discovered something unexpected, a bond forming between them, stronger than the barriers that had kept them apart. One afternoon, Robert Smith found Mary Johnson in his study, staring intently at a chess puzzle he'd left unsolved on the mahogany table. The millionaire paused in the doorway, observing the small figure who stood on tiptoes to reach the carved pieces. Her thin fingers hovered over the board with surprising confidence, her worn doll propped carefully beside the table as if watching the game. Robert remained silent, curious to see what the child would do. Mary's brow furrowed in concentration as she studied the arrangement. After several moments of contemplation, she moved the knight across the board, then shifted a pawn, and finally placed the bishop in a position that created an unexpected checkmate. It was an elegant solution he hadn't considered. "That's quite impressive," he said finally, stepping into the room. Mary jumped, nearly knocking over the pieces. "I'm sorry, sir, I shouldn't have touched your things." "On the contrary," Robert replied, his voice gentle. "You've solved a puzzle that has been vexing me all morning." He gestured to a nearby chair. "Would you care to play another?" Over the following weeks, these encounters became a quiet ritual. The businessman would casually leave mathematical riddles on scraps of paper or logic puzzles disguised as stories during their conversations. He never framed them as tests or lessons, merely as diversions. "If a merchant has 3 barrels, he might begin while they walk through the garden, and one contains vinegar while the others hold oil." Mary would listen intently, her eyes bright with concentration. Her solutions often came from unexpected angles, revealing a mind that didn't just absorb knowledge, but transformed it. "You see connections others miss," he told her one evening as she explained her approach to a particularly difficult problem involving a sequence of numbers. "Mrs. Brown says sometimes the answer is hiding in plain sight," she replied, then immediately looked alarmed at having mentioned her secret tutor. Robert merely nodded, filing away this confirmation of his suspicions about her evening errands to the village. He recognized in Mary the same spark he'd seen in her mother years ago, a natural intelligence that thrived despite circumstances, not because of them. What impressed him most wasn't merely her ability to solve the puzzles, but her hunger for understanding. Where Sarah Johnson might memorize an answer to please her mother, Mary sought to grasp the principles behind it. Her questions revealed a mind that wouldn't be satisfied with surface knowledge. Each time she surprised him with her insight, Robert became more certain of what he must do to honor his promise to her mother and to secure the future of this remarkable child. The evening air hung heavy with formality as the Johnson estate welcomed its distinguished guests. Crystal glasses clinked and silverware gleamed under the warm glow of the chandelier. Mary Johnson sat at the far end of the table, nearly invisible in her plain dress, watching the adults converse with practiced elegance. Mrs. Jennifer Johnson beamed with pride as Sarah recited a French poem for their visitors, her pronunciation flawless. The guests applauded politely, while the matriarch cast a warning glance toward Mary, silently commanding her to remain quiet and unnoticed. Among the guests was Professor William Harrington, a renowned literary scholar visiting from Oxford. The conversation turned to Shakespeare as servants cleared the soup course. The professor gestured dramatically with his napkin, wine sloshing dangerously close to the rim of his glass. As the immortal bard wrote in Hamlet's soliloquy, "To sweep, perchance to dream, aye, there's the point," he declared with authority. Mary's fingers tightened around her water glass. She had read Hamlet countless times in her mother's old notebook, memorizing passages by candlelight. The words felt wrong in her ears. Her heart raced as she weighed the consequences of speaking against the certainty of the error. "Excuse me, sir," Mary said softly, her voice barely audible above the clink of silverware. "I believe the line is 'there's the rub,' not 'there's the point.'" The table fell silent. Forks froze mid-air. Mrs. Johnson's face drained of color before flushing crimson. Sarah stared wide-eyed at her stepsister, half horrified and half impressed. Professor Harrington adjusted his spectacles, studying the small girl with newfound interest. "My dear child, are you quite certain?" Mary nodded, her voice steadier now. "Yes, sir. To die, to sleep perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come." The scholar's expression shifted from surprise to delight. "Remarkable. You are absolutely correct, young lady. I stand corrected." Mrs. Johnson's eyes burned with fury as she gripped her napkin. "Mary, you will excuse yourself immediately. How dare you contradict our guest?" "On the contrary," Robert Smith interrupted, his deep voice commanding attention. The millionaire's lips curled into a proud smile as he regarded Mary from across the table. "The child has demonstrated both knowledge and courage, qualities to be celebrated, not punished." The guests murmured in agreement, several nodding appreciatively toward Mary. For the first time, the household saw her not as an afterthought, but as someone with a mind of her own, a revelation that sent ripples through the carefully maintained hierarchy of the estate. The drawing room fell silent as Jennifer Johnson's voice cut through the air. Her face, usually composed in public, now twisted with calculated rage as she pointed an accusing finger at Mary. "Theft! I've discovered books missing from Sarah's collection, along with several valuable trinkets from the East Wing display. Mrs. Johnson's voice trembled with what appeared to be righteous indignation. "This cannot continue under my roof." Mary stood frozen, her small frame seeming to shrink further as the accusations piled higher. The worn doll she clutched provided little comfort against this new storm. She had borrowed books, yes, but only those Sarah had secretly given her. "I didn't steal anything, stepmother," Mary whispered, her voice barely audible over the ticking of the grandfather clock. Mrs. Johnson's lips curled into a cold smile. "Your denials mean nothing. I've already contacted Blackwell Institution for Wayward Girls." She produced a letter bearing an official seal. "They have agreed to take you next week." The words struck Mary like physical blows. Blackwell was notorious throughout the county, a place where difficult children were sent to be forgotten, where education consisted of endless domestic chores and strict discipline. "Mother, please." Sarah stepped forward, her exercise books still clutched in her hands. "Mary wouldn't steal. I gave her those books. She's been returning them faithfully." "Silence," Mrs. Johnson rounded on her daughter. "Your kindness is being manipulated. This girl has been nothing but trouble since your father brought her into our home." The matriarch summoned 2 servants who appeared with a small suitcase. "Pack her essentials, nothing more." Mary watched, numb with disbelief, as her few possessions were gathered. The servants moved with downcast eyes, avoiding her gaze as they folded her plain dresses and single spare pair of shoes. Sarah continued pleading, tears streaming down her face, but her mother's resolve remained unbroken. "You'll understand when you're older. Some people cannot be helped." That night, Mary sat on her bed beside the packed suitcase, staring out at the moon through rain-streaked windows. Her thoughts turned to Mrs. Brown in the village, to the library she'd barely glimpsed, to Robert Smith who had shown her kindness. Would anyone believe her? Would anyone stand against Mrs. Johnson's authority? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Sarah slipped inside, pressing something into Mary's palm, a small silver locket. "Keep this hidden," she whispered. "I've sent word to Mr. Smith. Don't lose hope." As Sarah disappeared down the hallway, Mary clutched the locket, her desperate hope flickering like a candle in a storm. Fragile, but not yet extinguished. The morning of the school board's annual inspection arrived with an air of formality that permeated every corner of the Johnson estate. Servants scurried about, polishing silver and arranging fresh flowers in crystal vases. Mary Johnson stood in the shadows of the grand hall, her small fingers nervously twisting the fabric of her plainest dress, watching as the distinguished gentlemen in their formal attire filed in with leather portfolios and solemn expressions. Jennifer Johnson swept into the room like royalty, her voice carrying with practiced charm as she greeted each board member by name. Behind her followed Sarah, dressed in her finest blue gown with ribbons perfectly arranged in her hair. The matriarch positioned her daughter prominently before the visitors, her hand resting possessively on the girl's shoulder. "Gentlemen, I present my daughter's exceptional progress," she announced, gesturing to a display of Sarah's immaculate exercise books and watercolor paintings. "Her French is impeccable, her penmanship exemplary, and her understanding of literature quite advanced for her age." The board members nodded appreciatively, making notes as Sarah recited poetry and demonstrated her knowledge of geography. Mary watched from behind a column, her heart pounding so loudly she feared everyone might hear it. The suitcase packed for her departure to the Institution for Wayward Girls waited by the servants' entrance, a physical reminder of her imminent fate. When Robert Smith entered the hall, a collective murmur rippled through the assembly. The millionaire's unexpected presence commanded immediate attention, his tall figure imposing even among the distinguished board members. "Mr. Smith, what a pleasant surprise!" exclaimed the board chairman, extending his hand. "We had no idea you were our guest of honor today." The businessman's eyes found Mary in her hiding place, offering her a subtle nod before addressing the gathering. "Gentlemen, before we conclude this inspection, I request the floor." His deep voice carried throughout the hall without effort, silencing all other conversation. Mrs. Johnson's smile faltered slightly as Robert continued. I believe an honest accounting of education in this household is required, not just of one child, but of both. He gestured toward Mary, who stepped forward with trembling legs. This child also resides here and deserves our attention. I demand we examine her educational opportunities with the same scrutiny. The stepmother's face paled as whispers erupted among the board members. Sarah glanced anxiously between her mother and stepsister, her loyalties visibly torn. What exactly are you implying, Mr. Smith? Asked the chairman, suddenly alert. I am implying, sir, Robert answered, his voice thundering through the hall, that there are secrets in this house that can no longer remain hidden, and I intend to bring them all to light. The grand hall fell silent as Mrs. Linda Brown stepped forward, her weathered hands clasped tightly before her. The elderly tutor's voice, though soft with age, carried unwavering conviction as she detailed Mary Johnson's remarkable progress during their clandestine lessons. The child has a natural aptitude for mathematics and literature that surpasses many students twice her age, Mrs. Brown testified, her gaze steady despite Mrs. Jennifer Johnson's venomous glare from across the room. Sarah Johnson rose next, her shoulders squared despite her trembling hands. I've been helping Mary study, she confessed, avoiding her mother's eyes. I gave her my old grammar books and maps. She deserved the same chance I had. The young girl's admission sent whispers rippling through the assembled board members. Robert Smith strode to the center of the room, his cane tapping rhythmically against the polished floor. From his coat, he produced a leather portfolio filled with financial documents. The businessman spread them methodically before the board. These are the estate accounts, he announced, his deep voice resonating through the hall. You'll note that funds specifically allocated for Mary's education in her father's will have been systematically diverted to Sarah's tutors and materials for the past 3 years. Mrs. Johnson leapt to her feet. How dare you question my management of this household? You have no authority. But I do, Robert interrupted, producing another document bearing an official seal. I am Mary's legal godfather, appointed by her parents before their passing. Gasps echoed through the hall. Mary's eyes widened, her small frame frozen in disbelief. Elizabeth Johnson, Mary's mother, was one of the finest scholarly minds of her generation, Robert continued, his voice softening as he glanced at the child. Her published works on mathematics are still referenced in universities across England. Before her death, she made me promise to ensure her daughter would have every opportunity to follow in her footsteps. The matriarch's face drained of color. This is preposterous. The girl shows no such aptitude. Because you've denied her every opportunity to demonstrate it, Mrs. Brown interjected, finding new courage. Yet still she learned, in secret, by candlelight, after completing double the chores of any child her age. Mary stood trembling, tears streaming silently down her cheeks, not from fear, but from the revelation of her mother's legacy. All these years, she had felt the pull toward knowledge without understanding why it burned so fiercely within her. Robert Smith placed a gentle hand on Mary's shoulder. From this day forward, he declared, Mary's education will proceed as her parents intended, and as is her birthright. The Johnson estate seemed to hold its breath in the days following the confrontation. Servants whispered in corners, their usual routines disrupted by the shifting power within the household. Mrs. Jennifer Johnson moved through the halls like a diminished shadow, her authority visibly crumbling as truth after truth emerged. Robert Smith arrived one morning carrying a weathered leather portfolio. These belong to your father, he told Mary, his voice gentle as he placed several yellowed letters before her. Mary's fingers trembled as she unfolded the first page, recognizing her father's elegant script. My dearest daughters, the letter began, addressing both Mary and Sarah as equals. It is my deepest wish that you grow together as sisters, each receiving the same opportunities for education and advancement." Tears welled in Mary's eyes as she read his explicit instructions that both girls be raised without preference or distinction. Sarah, who had been hovering in the doorway, stepped forward hesitantly. "May I?" she asked, reaching for one of the letters. As she read, her face paled. "Mother never told me any of this." The most damning evidence came when Mrs. Linda Brown visited the estate at Robert's invitation. Standing tall despite her years, the elderly tutor faced Mrs. Johnson across the drawing room. "I was dismissed 4 years ago," Mrs. Brown explained, her voice steady, "because I refused to follow your instructions to provide Mary with inferior lessons. You specifically ordered me to ensure Sarah always appeared more accomplished." Mrs. Johnson's protests died on her lips when Robert produced the original employment contract and termination letter. "But the library," Mary whispered, remembering the room that had been forbidden to her for so long. Robert nodded, a sad smile crossing his face. "That's perhaps the greatest irony. The library was built by your maternal grandfather, a renowned scholar who valued education above all else. It was specifically mentioned in your mother's marriage settlement as your inheritance." The matriarch sank into a chair, her facade finally cracking. "The estate was failing when I married into this family," she admitted, her voice hollow. "Sarah was all I had to secure our future." "By denying Mary her birthright?" Robert challenged. For once, Mrs. Johnson had no answer. That evening, Mary stood in the center of the library, running her fingers along spines of books that had belonged to her grandfather. The room seemed to welcome her, as if it had been waiting all along. Sarah joined her silently, carrying 2 cups of tea. "I never knew," Sarah said simply. Mary nodded, understanding that her stepsister had been as much a pawn as she had been a victim. "Now we both know," she replied, offering Sarah a book from the shelf. "Perhaps we can learn together." Robert Smith arranged a meeting with Mrs. Linda Brown in the library, while Mrs. Jennifer Johnson was away on social calls. The elderly tutor arrived discreetly through the servants' entrance, her weathered hands carrying a leather portfolio containing examination papers from the county's most prestigious academy. "Are you certain she's ready?" Mrs. Brown whispered, her eyes reflecting both hope and concern. "More than ready," Robert replied, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the polished floor. "Mary has been preparing her entire life, though she didn't know it." The examination took place in Robert's study. 3 hours of mathematics, literature, sciences, and languages. Mary Johnson sat at the massive oak desk, her small frame dwarfed by the furniture. Yet her concentration never wavered. The worn doll that usually accompanied her everywhere remained tucked safely in her apron pocket, a silent witness to this pivotal moment. When the examination concluded, Mrs. Brown collected the papers with trembling hands. "I shall grade these immediately," she said, her voice betraying her excitement. 3 days later, the results arrived by messenger. Robert gathered the household staff, Sarah, and a reluctant Mrs. Johnson in the main drawing room. Mary stood near the doorway, uncertain whether she belonged in this formal gathering. "Mary's examination results," Robert announced, unfolding the document with deliberate slowness, "place her not only among the qualified candidates, but at the very top of this year's applicants to St. Catherine's Academy for Exceptional Young Minds." Gasps echoed through the room. Sarah's eyes widened in genuine admiration, while her mother's face hardened into a mask of disbelief. "Impossible," Mrs. Johnson hissed. "There must be some mistake." "No mistake," Mrs. Brown confirmed, stepping forward from the shadows. "I've been teaching for 40 years. This child has a remarkable mind." Robert then produced another document, yellowed with age, bearing the official seal of the late Mr. Johnson's solicitor. "And now," he continued, "I must read the stipulation in the family will that Mrs. Johnson has conveniently neglected to mention." His voice filled the room as he read. "The Johnson Educational Trust, comprising 1/3 of the estate's value, shall be awarded to whichever child demonstrates the greatest aptitude and character by their 10th year." The implications settled over the room like dust after an explosion. Mary would soon turn 10. The trust would provide not only for her education, but grant her financial independence within the household. "The future of this estate," Robert concluded, fixing Mrs. Johnson with an unwavering stare, and indeed both girls, now hangs in a new balance. Mary Johnson's triumph in the academic assessment came at a steep price. The morning after her remarkable results were announced, Mrs. Linda Brown received a formal notice of eviction from her cottage. The elderly tutor stood in her doorway, hands trembling as she read the document bearing Mrs. Jennifer Johnson's signature, citing interference in household matters as grounds for removal. "You have 1 week," the messenger had said before turning on his heel. Meanwhile, inside the Johnson estate, Sarah's bedroom door remained locked from the outside. Her punishment for aiding her stepsister was swift and severe. The young girl's meals arrived on trays, slid beneath her door with hardly a word. At night, Mary could hear muffled sobs through the wall, separating their rooms. "You've chosen your allegiance poorly," Mrs. Johnson had declared to her daughter, before turning the key. "Perhaps solitude will remind you of your proper place in this family." Throughout the mansion, servants exchanged knowing glances. The cook whispered to the gardener about that poor child upstairs, while the housekeeper's lips tightened whenever the mistress entered a room. Mrs. Johnson's authority, once absolute, now rested on increasingly shaky ground, as tales of her deception spread through the household like autumn mist. Yet amid this turmoil, Mary's resolve only strengthened. Each afternoon, she slipped away to Mrs. Brown's cottage, carrying what little food she could smuggle from the kitchen. "You mustn't risk yourself for me," the tutor protested, though gratitude shone in her tired eyes. "You risked everything for my education," Mary replied, setting down a small basket of bread and preserves. "I won't abandon you now." Under cover of darkness, Mary would also creep to Sarah's room, whispering encouragement through the keyhole and sliding folded notes beneath the door. Simple puzzles and riddles to keep her stepsister's mind engaged during her confinement. One evening, Robert Smith discovered Mary kneeling outside Sarah's door, a small plate of biscuits beside her. "Even now you show compassion," he observed quietly, his tall figure casting a long shadow in the hallway's dim light. Mary looked up, unashamed. "Sarah helped me when no one else would. She doesn't deserve this punishment." The businessman nodded thoughtfully, his cane tapping gently against the wooden floor. "True strength isn't measured by what we achieve for ourselves, but by how we lift others when they fall." Despite everything, the threats, the punishments, the uncertain future, Mary continued her studies with unwavering dedication. Each night, she read by candlelight, preparing not just for her own future, but for the day when all doors in the Johnson estate would stand open. Golden leaves carpeted the Johnson estate grounds as autumn painted the countryside in amber hues. The grand assembly hall, rarely used except for the most formal occasions, now buzzed with anticipation. Distinguished guests from across the county had gathered, educators, magistrates, and families of influence, all seated in neat rows facing the ornate podium where Robert Smith stood, commanding attention with his mere presence. Mary Johnson sat in the front row, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her worn doll, her constant companion through years of struggle, tucked discreetly beside her. Sarah reached over and squeezed her stepsister's hand, a gesture unimaginable just months before. "Today," Robert announced, his deep voice carrying to the farthest corner, we celebrate not just academic achievement, but the triumph of character. He unfolded a piece of paper with careful reverence. I shall read the words of a child who, despite every obstacle, never surrendered her right to knowledge. As Robert began reading Mary's essay on education and opportunity, the young girl's eloquent words filled the hall. Her writing spoke of learning not as privilege, but as birthright, of books as bridges between worlds, of knowledge as the truest inheritance. The audience sat transfixed, many blinking back tears at the wisdom flowing from one so young, yet so tested by circumstance. Mrs. Jennifer Johnson shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her face a careful mask that barely concealed her displeasure. The matriarch's authority had crumbled beneath the weight of exposed truths and redirected funds meant for both girls' education. When Robert finished reading, he looked directly at Mary. It is my honor to announce that Mary Johnson has been named recipient of the Johnson Academic Endowment, securing her education through university and beyond. Applause erupted, led enthusiastically by Mrs. Linda Brown, whose weathered face shone with vindication and pride. The elderly tutor had risked everything to nurture Mary's brilliant mind in secret. The moment carried a bittersweet edge. Mary's victory had come at tremendous cost. Nights of hidden study, tears shed in silence, and the painful awareness that her own family had tried to extinguish her potential. Yet here she stood, recognized at last. Later, as guests mingled in the estate gardens, Mary found herself beside the ornate fountain where she had once hidden to read by moonlight. Robert approached, leaning slightly on his cane. "Your mother would be immensely proud," he said softly. Mary nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "This isn't just my victory," she whispered. "It belongs to everyone who believed when others wouldn't." The autumn breeze carried her words away, but their truth remained. A legacy reborn, a future reclaimed, and a little girl's dream finally stepping into the light. In the months that followed, the Johnson estate underwent a remarkable transformation. The massive oak doors of the library, once firmly closed to Mary, now stood wide open, not only to her, but to all children from the surrounding village. Light streamed through tall windows, illuminating dusty volumes that had waited patiently for eager young minds. Mrs. Linda Brown returned to the estate, not as a dismissed tutor, but as the head educator. The elderly woman moved with renewed purpose, her wisdom finally given the respect it deserved. Under her guidance, the study that had once been Sarah's exclusive domain became a place of shared discovery. "Your mother would be so proud," Mrs. Linda Brown whispered to Mary one afternoon as they arranged books for the following day's lessons. The girl smiled, running her fingers over her mother's notebook that now sat prominently on the main desk, no longer hidden behind loose bricks, but celebrated as the scholarly legacy it was. Sarah and Mary sat side by side during lessons, their shoulders occasionally touching as they bent over their exercise books. The older girl had abandoned her previous aloofness, finding unexpected joy in her stepsister's company. Together they tackled Latin verbs and mathematical equations, their rivalry transformed into mutual support. "I never realized learning could be this enjoyable," Sarah confessed one evening as they practiced astronomy on the estate's east lawn. Mary simply squeezed her hand in response, words unnecessary between them now. Robert Smith observed these changes with quiet satisfaction, his tall figure often seen walking the grounds with Mary at his side. The businessman had reduced his travels to remain at the estate, stepping naturally into the role of father figure. Under his watchful eye, Mary blossomed like a flower finally given sunlight. Mrs. Jennifer Johnson remained in the household, though her influence had diminished considerably. The matriarch moved through rooms like a ghost of her former self, watching as the home she had ruled with cold authority transformed into something warmer and more inclusive. One evening, as autumn painted the countryside in amber and gold, Mary stood by the library window, watching village children depart after their lessons. Robert Smith joined her, his cane tapping softly against the polished floor. "For the first time, I feel like I truly belong here," Mary admitted, her voice soft but confident. The millionaire nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "This estate was always meant to be a place of growth and learning. You've restored its true purpose." Mary Johnson, once the forgotten child behind locked doors, had become the beating heart of a family rebuilt on truth, her quiet determination reshaping not only her own destiny, but the legacy of the Johnson name itself. On a crisp autumn morning, Mary Johnson stood at the front of a classroom, plain dress and book in hand, her eyes bright with quiet pride. The sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the faces of 20 village children seated before her. 5 years had passed since that rainy day when she had pressed her forehead against the cold glass, begging for the chance to learn. Now, at 13, she commanded the attention of students, eager for knowledge. "Today, we explore the wonders of mathematics," she announced, her voice steady and warm. The classroom, once the estate's converted carriage house, had been Robert Smith's gift to the county, a place where no child would ever be turned away from learning. Mary moved between the wooden desks, helping a small girl with tangled hair who reminded her so much of herself. "Never be afraid to ask questions," she whispered, squeezing the child's shoulder. "Curiosity is not a burden, but a light." From the doorway, Sarah observed her stepsister with undisguised admiration. Their relationship had blossomed into something neither could have imagined in those early days of whispered lessons and secret alliances. Now 17, Sarah assisted with the advanced classes, her French and literature skills complementing Mary's gift for mathematics and science. Mrs. Brown sat in the corner, her elderly hands folded contentedly in her lap. The former tutor now served as the school's headmistress, overseeing a curriculum that rivaled the finest institutions in England. Her cottage had become a library where children borrowed books without fear or shame. When Robert Smith visited, which he did monthly despite his business commitments, he would watch Mary teach with tears glistening in his eyes. "Your mother would be so proud," he often told her, his cane tapping gently against the floorboards. "You've exceeded even her dreams." The Johnson estate had transformed as well. Mrs. Jennifer Johnson had retreated to a cousin's home in London, her authority diminished by truth and time. The grand house now hosted weekly lectures and reading circles, its doors open to all who sought knowledge. Mary's story spread throughout the county and beyond. How a little girl who once cried behind locked doors had changed not just her own fate, but the educational landscape for generations to come. Families spoke of her at dinner tables. Teachers invoked her name when encouraging reluctant students. Remember, Mary would tell her pupils as they departed each afternoon, knowledge belongs to everyone willing to seek it. She would stand at the schoolhouse door, watching them scatter into the autumn air, each carrying a piece of her triumph within them, each a testament to hope, resilience, and the unbreakable power of learning.